My daughter sold my wedding ring. You're a widow anyway. Why do you need it? I woke up and discovered it was gone. She didn't know that the ring had a secret compartment. What I did 3 days later made her. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway, and I am 71 years old. I was born in a small town in Ohio, married at 23, and spent 46 years of my life with a man named Harold. People called us old-fashioned. I called us blessed. Harold died 3 years ago, a quiet Thursday morning in November, with the smell of coffee still hanging in the kitchen and his reading glasses resting open on the nightstand as if he had simply stepped away and would be back in a moment. He never came back. I kept the house. Our house. A white 2-story colonial on Maple Grove Drive in Dayton with a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. After Harold passed, I kept both chairs. I sat in mine. I talked to his. People who knew me understood. People who didn't thought I was losing my mind. I wasn't losing my mind. I was grieving, and grief looks different to everyone. My daughter, Renee, had been pushing me to move for over a year before any of this began. She was 51, sharp-tongued, and organized in the particular way that organized people become when they want to control something they don't own. She lived 40 minutes away in a newer development outside Centerville with her second husband, Gary, and their combined household of opinions about what was best for everyone else. Her older daughter, my granddaughter Amber, 26, had recently moved in with them after losing her apartment. That household had 3 adults, 2 dogs, and one shared conviction: that I was a problem to be managed. "Mom, the house is too big for one person," Renee said at Thanksgiving. "You rattle around in there." I didn't rattle. I gardened. I read. I had my neighbor June over for cards on Wednesdays. I volunteered at the public library twice a week. I was not a woman rattling around in a house. I was a woman living her life. And there is a profound difference. The first warning sign came in January. I noticed a small ceramic bowl from Harold's study. Nothing expensive, something he had bought at a craft fair in Vermont in 1987, sitting on Renee's mantelpiece when I visited for her birthday. I stared at it for a long moment before saying anything. "That bowl," I said. "Where did you get it?" Renee glanced at it the way you glance at something you've deliberately placed in plain sight, banking on the hope that the other person won't look too closely. "I thought you were clearing things out," she said. "I never said that. You mentioned donating things." I mentioned donating some of Harold's old clothes to the church drive. That bowl was not on any list. She changed the subject. I let her that time. I drove home and stood in Harold's study for a long while, taking a slow inventory. I couldn't immediately identify anything else missing, but I felt the shift, that cold, low hum of something being off. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief makes you protective of objects to an unhealthy degree. I talked myself into doubt, which is what people who love us are counting on. The second warning sign came in February. Renee and Amber came to help me, as they put it, reorganize the guest bedroom. I made lunch. They sorted boxes. When they left, I felt uneasy, but couldn't name why. It took me 2 days to realize that a small pearl brooch, a gift from Harold on our 25th anniversary, was no longer in the glass dish on my dresser. I called Renee. She said she hadn't seen it. Amber didn't pick up. I told myself misplaced things at my age, another lie I almost believed. Then came the morning of March the 4th. I woke early, as I always do, made coffee, and went to my jewelry box, a mahogany box Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary, to take out my wedding ring. I wore it every day. I had worn it for 48 years. I opened the box and the velvet indent where the ring had always rested was empty. I stood very still. The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a bird called twice and went silent. I searched every drawer, every surface, every pocket of every coat in the hall closet. I got down on my knees and looked under the dresser. I checked the bathroom, the nightstand, the kitchen counter. An hour passed. The ring was not in the house. The previous afternoon, Renee and Amber had stopped by unannounced. They had stayed for 2 hours. They had said they just wanted to check on me. I sat down at the kitchen table and the full weight of what I had been refusing to see settled over me like something cold and final. The bowl, the brooch, and now this. Harold had placed a thin band of diamonds around that ring for our 30th anniversary. He had stood in this kitchen, nervous as a young man, and slipped it back on my finger and said, "You deserve more than I've given you, Dot." I had told him he was a fool. I had meant it as the highest praise, and now it was gone. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway, because I needed something in my hands, and I made myself think clearly. I was not confused. I was not misremembering. I knew what had happened, and I knew who had done it, and sitting in that kitchen at 7 in the morning on March the 4th, I knew with absolute certainty that I was not going to let it go. I spent the rest of that morning sitting at Harold's old desk in the study, with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I am a methodical woman by nature. Harold used to say I approached problems the way a good carpenter approaches a warped board, slowly, without forcing, looking for the grain. I wrote down every item I believed was missing: the Vermont ceramic bowl, the pearl brooch, now the wedding ring. I left space at the bottom of the list because I suspected there were things I hadn't noticed yet. Then I walked through the house room by room, slowly, the way I hadn't allowed myself to do in the weeks before. I opened drawers. I checked shelves. I looked at photographs to remind myself what should have been nearby and wasn't. By noon, the list had grown to 7 items. A small silver picture frame from the hallway, Harold's good fountain pen from the study, a pair of antique crystal candlestick holders that had belonged to his mother, a hand-painted music box my sister had given me for my 40th birthday. None of these things were valuable in any significant financial sense, but I knew their prices. I knew what such things sold for at estate sales and pawn shops and the kind of resale websites Amber scrolled through on her phone. I knew that together they added up to something. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to have been worth stealing. That word came to me plainly, without drama. Stealing. My daughter and granddaughter had been stealing from me. I sat with that for a long time. It is one thing to suspect it. It is another thing to write it on a yellow legal pad and read it back to yourself in the afternoon, quiet of a house that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco Harold had given up 20 years ago. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Not afraid in the way that makes you act recklessly, but afraid in the way that makes the world feel unreliable. When someone you have loved and fed and worried over and defended against the world turns out to be the very thing you needed defending from. I thought about the years I had listened to Renee complain about money, Gary's business setbacks, Amber's difficulties holding a job. I had helped, financially and otherwise, more times than I could count. I had never kept a ledger. Harold had told me not to keep a ledger with family. I had agreed with him then. I wasn't so sure now, but fear was not going to be the thing that determined what happened next. I made a decision at that desk, quietly and without ceremony, the way I make most decisions that matter. I was going to find that ring. I was going to document everything. and I was going to make sure that what had been taken from me, not just the objects, but my dignity, my trust, my right to live in my own home without being preyed upon, was acknowledged and answered for. The question was how. I was not the sort of person who called a lawyer impulsively. I was not the sort of person who made accusations in public without evidence. But I was also 71 years old with a list of 7 stolen items and a clear understanding of who had taken them. I needed documentation before I did anything official. I needed proof that would hold up to scrutiny. The first part of the plan came to me that evening when I remembered something. 3 years ago, after a series of mail thefts in the neighborhood, my neighbor June's son-in-law, a quiet man named Phil who worked in home security, had helped several of us on Maple Grove install small indoor cameras, discreet ones positioned near entry points, the kind that stored footage on a cloud account. I had one in the front hallway, pointed at the door. I had another in the living room, installed mostly because June had been insistent, and I hadn't wanted to argue. I had never once looked at the footage. I had forgotten the cameras were there. I found the login information in a notebook I kept in Harold's desk drawer. He had always written down passwords, a habit that had annoyed me when he was alive and now felt like one more small gift from him. I sat at the old laptop on the desk and opened the security application. It took me 20 minutes to navigate the interface. My hands were steadier than I expected. The camera in the hallway had recorded Renee and Amber's visit the previous afternoon, both of them moving through the front entry. Amber going upstairs while Renee stayed in the kitchen with me. Amber coming back down 12 minutes later. I couldn't see what she had in her hands. The angle was wrong, but she had been upstairs, alone, for 12 minutes. That was not proof, but it was a beginning. I wrote down the timestamp. I wrote down the date. I called Phil the next morning and asked him, with as much calm as I could manage, whether the footage could be exported and saved. He said yes, and offered to come over and show me how. I said that would be very helpful. I didn't tell him why. I was also going to need to find the ring, not just to have it back, though God knows I wanted it back, but because a stolen object in someone's possession is evidence in a way that an empty jewelry box is not. I thought about where Amber would have taken it. She had no steady income. She needed cash quickly. That meant a pawn shop, a resale platform, or a private buyer. I knew she used online resale apps. I knew her screen name from the time she had asked me to leave a review for something she'd sold. I opened a browser window. I typed in her username. And there, listed 2 days prior, was a vintage diamond wedding band. Yellow gold. Round solitaire with an anniversary band of small channel-set diamonds. Described as a family piece, no longer needed. My hands stopped being steady. I took a screenshot. I saved it 3 places. And then I sat back and let myself feel the full measure of what this was. Not with hysteria, but with the cold, clear knowledge that I now had something I hadn't had that morning. I had evidence. I called Phil that same afternoon, and he came over the following morning, a Thursday, with his laptop and a patience that I found genuinely kind. He sat at Harold's desk and walked me through exporting the hallway footage, saving it as files with timestamps, and copying everything to a USB drive as well as a secure cloud folder. He didn't ask questions, but he looked at me once with the particular expression of a man who has put together a picture without being told to. "You doing all right, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked. "I'm doing what needs doing," I told him. That was the most honest answer I had. I had already printed the screenshot of Amber's online listing that morning, along with the item description and the asking price. $220. $220. I had worn that ring through the birth of Renee, through Harold's cancer scare in 2003, through a kitchen fire and 2 hurricanes and 48 years of an ordinary life that was extraordinary to me. and it had been listed for $220. After Phil left, I drove to the Dayton Public Library, not the branch where I volunteered, but the main branch downtown, where I was less likely to run into anyone who knew me. I used one of the public computers and spent 2 hours researching. I looked up Ohio theft law. I looked up elder financial abuse statutes, which are different from general theft and carry their own classifications in Ohio. I looked up the process for filing a police report and what documentation was typically required. I printed everything I found and put it in a manila folder. I also called an attorney. Her name was Margaret Osee, and I had met her once at a library fundraiser the previous year. She specialized in estate law, but she had referred cases to a colleague who handled elder abuse litigation, and she agreed to see me the following Monday. I didn't tell her much on the phone, only that I believed property had been taken from my home by a family member, that I had documentation, and that I wanted to understand my legal options before taking any action. She said that was a sensible approach. I thanked her and wrote the appointment in my calendar in ink. I did not call Renee. I did not call Amber. I went home, cooked a proper dinner for the first time in weeks. Chicken with green beans and a biscuit. Harold's Thursday meal. And I ate it at the kitchen table and felt, for the first time since March the 4th, like myself. But Renee called me. She called Friday evening, which was not unusual. What was unusual was her tone. She started with the normal questions. How was I feeling? Had I been getting out? Was I eating properly? And then she shifted. Amber mentioned you seemed a little distracted when you called her, Renee said. I left Amber a voicemail, I said. She didn't call back. A brief silence. She said you asked about some jewelry. I asked if she'd seen my wedding ring, I said. That's all. Mom. Her voice took on the particular quality it got when she was managing me. Patient. Slightly tired. You know you misplace things sometimes. Remember the time you lost your keys for a week and they were in the freezer? I remembered no such thing, and we both knew it. Harold had put his keys in the freezer once, and we had laughed about it together for years. She had simply reassigned the story. The ring isn't misplaced, I said. Have you checked everywhere? Yes. Well, I'm sure it'll turn up. A pause. Gary and I were thinking about stopping by Sunday. We could help you look. What they were proposing was coming to my house to see what I knew and what I had done with what I knew. I understood that clearly. Renee was not a stupid woman. She had sensed from Amber's nervousness over that voicemail that something had shifted. She wanted to assess the situation before it moved beyond her control. Sunday doesn't work for me, I said. I have plans. Another silence, longer this time. Plans? The word had a slight edge to it. Yes, I said. Plans. I said goodnight and hung up. On Saturday, I drove to a pawn shop on Salem Avenue. I had called ahead and described the ring, the yellow gold band, the solitaire, the anniversary wrapping, and asked if anyone had brought in anything matching that description in the past week. The woman on the phone had been cautious, as they tend to be. But when I walked in and explained that I was the owner of the ring, that I had documentation including photographs and the original sizing record from the jeweler, and that I was prepared to involve the police, the manager, a heavy-set man named Sal, with tired eyes, opened his display case and showed me a ring. My ring, Harold's ring, sitting on a small velvet square under fluorescent light. I pressed my hand against the counter to keep myself upright. I did not cry in front of Sal. I waited until I was in my car in the parking lot, and then I sat there for 3 minutes, and I let myself cry. And then I stopped, because there was still work to do. Sal told me the ring had been brought in 4 days earlier by a young woman matching Amber's description. He had a copy of her ID on file, as required by Ohio law for precious metal transactions. He showed me, without touching, the copy on his screen. Amber Lynn Trask. Her photograph. her address in Centerville. I had my proof. Not a suspicion. Not a screenshot of a listing. A pawnshop record with her legal identification, the physical ring, and a transaction date 2 days after she had been alone in my bedroom for 12 minutes. I drove home. I called Margaret Osie's office and left a message saying I had additional documentation she would want to see before Monday. The point of no return is not always loud. Sometimes it is a Tuesday afternoon in a pawnshop on Salem Avenue, standing in fluorescent light, looking at the ring your husband put on your finger in 1976, and understanding precisely what you are going to do next. Monday morning, I sat across from Margaret Osie in her office on 3rd Street. A calm, orderly room with good lighting and a plant on the windowsill that someone actually remembered to water. I laid everything out on her desk. The printed screenshot of the online listing, the USB drive with the security footage timestamps, the notes I had made with dates and item descriptions, and the information Sal had given me about the pawnshop transaction. Margaret looked at each piece carefully, without rushing, and when she had gone through everything, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at me. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "what you have here is not nothing. In Ohio, the theft of property from an elderly person, particularly by a family member in a position of trust, can be charged as elder financial abuse under ORC 2913.02 in conjunction with the Elder Abuse Enhancement provisions. Depending on the total assessed value, we may be looking at a felony classification. I'm not primarily interested in putting my granddaughter in prison," I said. "I want the ring back. I want the other items accounted for. And I want this to stop." Margaret nodded. "Those are achievable goals, but achieving them will likely require filing a police report. Once law enforcement is involved, the process has its own momentum. You should be prepared for that." I told her I understood. I told her I was prepared. She referred me to a colleague, a criminal attorney named James Whitfield, who agreed to see me that same afternoon. He was direct, matter of fact, and did not treat me as though I were fragile, which I appreciated more than I could say. He reviewed the same documents and confirmed Margaret's assessment. He also said something that I wrote down in my notebook word for word. The security footage establishing opportunity, combined with the pawnshop transaction record, constitutes a strong evidentiary foundation. Tuesday morning, I went to the Dayton Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was a young woman named Officer Chen, and she listened carefully and did not once suggest that I might have simply misplaced the ring. She documented everything I gave her and told me the case would be assigned to a detective within a few days. She also gave me a case number and a direct line. I drove home in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in March and sat in both rocking chairs, mine and Harold's, for a little while. The air was still cold, but there was a faint smell of thaw in it, the particular smell Ohio gets in the weeks before spring actually commits. I told Harold what I had done. I told him I had been methodical. I told him I thought he would have approved. The call came Thursday. Renee's number appeared on my phone at 6:47 in the evening. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short and her voice was shaking. "Mom, a detective called Gary's phone today. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to call me back right now." I listened to the message twice, deleted it, and called James Whitfield to let him know that contact had been made. He advised me not to speak to Renee directly without counsel present and to document any further contact. I wrote the date, time, and content of the voicemail in my notebook. She called again at 8. I didn't answer. Gary called at 8:15. I didn't answer. Amber called at 8:45. I picked up because I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to know what she sounded like when she was cornered. She sounded young and frightened and, beneath the fright, furious in the way only the entitled can be when consequence appears on their horizon for the first time. "Grandma," she said, "I need you to call the police and tell them it was a misunderstanding." "Was it a misunderstanding, Amber?" A pause. "You have so much stuff. You don't even wear that ring anymore. You're—" She stopped. "I'm what?" I said. "You're a widow," she said, and the word came out with a kind of impatience that told me she had said it to herself many times before. "You're already a widow. What do you need it for?" As though widowhood were a condition that suspended your right to your own belongings. "I'm going to say this once," I told her. "Return everything that was taken from this house, every item, with a written list of what was sold, where, and for how much. If you do that and cooperate fully with the detective assigned to this case, there may be a path forward that doesn't end in a criminal record. If you don't, I will not intercede, and the process will proceed without my involvement." She hung up. 20 minutes later, Renee called again. This time, I answered. The conversation was 40 minutes long and one of the most exhausting of my life. She cycled through every version of blame. I was being vindictive. I was destroying the family. I didn't understand how much pressure they had all been under. Gary's business had been struggling. Amber had student loans. I had more than I needed, more than I could use. And had I stopped to think about what Harold would have wanted? Harold, she told me, would have wanted her to have those things. Harold, I said quietly, would have called the police himself. She cried. I waited. When she stopped, I told her to speak with a lawyer and I said goodnight, and I hung up. I took a long bath that night. I sat in the hot water until the room had gone cool, and I thought about nothing in particular. The shape of the tiles, the sound of the pipes, the way steam makes patterns on the mirror. I had been fighting for 2 weeks and my body felt it. I had earned the right to feel it. I spent the next 3 days quietly. I gardened, even though the ground was still partly frozen. I had June over for cards. I drove to the library on Wednesday and helped the children's librarian organize the spring reading display. I talked to Harold each evening. I slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking at 3 a.m. with my heart pounding. The plan had been set in motion. Now it had to run. The letter came on a Saturday, 11 days after I'd filed the police report. It wasn't from an attorney, which surprised me, but from Renee herself. Handwritten on stationery I recognized from the set I had given her 3 Christmases ago. Blue paper, narrow lines. She had always had better handwriting than me. The letter was 4 pages long. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of what I can only describe as tactical sympathy. She wrote about her childhood. She wrote about missing Harold. She wrote about the difficulty of watching me grieve, of feeling helpless from 40 minutes away, of worrying that I was isolating and that the house was too large and that she had only ever wanted what was best for me. She wrote that the things she and Amber had taken, and here, for the first time, she used the word taken, though she surrounded it immediately with so many qualifications it nearly disappeared, were meant to be kept safe, not sold, and that the situation had gotten away from them, and she was deeply sorry, and could we please sit down together as a family and find a resolution before this went any further. It was a beautifully written letter. Some of it, I suspected, was even true. I read it twice. I set it on Harold's desk. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put it in the manila folder with the rest of the documentation, because whatever else it was also a written admission that items had been taken from my home, and it had her signature at the bottom. That was the temptation they were counting on. The pull of the letter, its appeals to shared grief, to family, to the idea that all of this could be quietly resolved between us like reasonable people, was real. I felt it. I won't pretend I didn't. Renee was my daughter. There had been good years. There had been birthday dinners and Christmas mornings, and the particular irreplaceable tenderness of watching your child become an adult and believing you had done something right. None of that was nothing. But none of that had stopped her. I had a meeting with James Whitfield the following Monday. I brought the letter. He read it carefully and then looked up at me with an expression I had come to recognize. Professional neutrality, with a layer of quiet respect underneath. This letter may actually be beneficial to your case, he said. It establishes awareness and acknowledgement. But I want to be very clear, Mrs. Calloway. Do not respond to this letter directly. Do not agree to any family meeting, and do not sign anything presented to you outside of this office. I know, I said. Do you need me to tell you anything else? No, I said. I just needed to bring it to you. I left his office and walked down 3rd Street in the thin spring sunshine, and I felt, this is the only word for it, clear. Not happy, exactly. Not victorious. Just clear. Like a window that has been properly cleaned. I did need support, though. Not legal support, personal support, and I found it in a place I had not expected. My friend June had known since the beginning that something was wrong in the way old friends know. Through the small tells, the silences at the wrong moments, the slight change in how you carry yourself. I had kept her at a distance deliberately, wanting to handle things through proper channels before involving anyone in the emotional territory. But that Saturday evening, after I'd put the letter in the folder and cooked myself supper, I walked next door and knocked on June's door and stood on her porch in my coat and told her everything. She listened without interrupting for 45 minutes. Then she made tea, the strong kind she kept for what she called serious occasions. And she put the cup in front of me and said, "Well, Dorothy, it's a good thing Harold taught you to be methodical." "He did," I said. "Are you eating?" "Better than I was." "Are you sleeping?" "Yes." She nodded. "Then you're going to be all right." There was nothing else she needed to say, and she knew it. We sat with our tea until it was dark outside, and she asked about the case, and I told her what I could. And she told me about her son-in-law, Phil. And I reminded her that Phil had been the one to help me with the camera footage, and she laughed and said the whole neighborhood owed Phil a debt at this point. We laughed. I hadn't laughed in a while. It felt like something stiff being gently worked loose. Renee and Gary drove slowly past my house that Sunday afternoon. I was in the front yard, turning soil in the flower bed along the porch. They didn't stop. They drove past at the speed of people trying to look like they aren't looking, and I kept my back to them and continued working. And I heard the car slow as it passed and then accelerate away. They were watching. That was fine. Let them watch. I was gardening. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, in my own yard, on my own property, on a Sunday afternoon in March, doing exactly as I pleased. Their watching didn't frighten me. Their watching told me they were calculating, and calculating people who are frightened make mistakes. I patted the cold earth down around the first bulbs I'd put in and went inside to wash my hands. They came on a Tuesday evening without calling first. I was in the kitchen making soup when I heard the car in the driveway. A sound I knew, the particular way Gary's SUV settled when he cut the engine. I turned off the burner and stood at the counter for a moment, steadying myself, and then I went to the front door and opened it before they had a chance to knock. All 3 of them, Renee, Gary, and Amber. Renee was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. Amber was holding flowers, yellow tulips, my favorite, which told me they had asked Renee what I liked and prepared accordingly. Gary stood slightly behind both women with his hands in his jacket pockets, the way he always stood when he was trying to look neutral, and was not. "We wanted to bring dinner," Renee said. Her voice was soft, carefully soft. "I've already started supper," I said. "We can put this in the fridge," she said. "Just, can we come in, Mom, please? Just to talk." I looked at Amber. She was looking at the porch floor. The tulips were trembling slightly because her hands were not steady. I stepped back and let them in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had first made my list on a yellow legal pad. the same table where I had drunk cold coffee on the morning of March the 4th. I put the casserole in the fridge without looking at it and poured 4 glasses of water and sat down. Gary opened. He was, in his professional life, a man who managed negotiations, and he brought that energy into my kitchen like he was presenting a business proposal. He talked about family cohesion. He talked about the strain that legal proceedings placed on everyone, including the elderly. He used that word, elderly, with such deliberate gentleness that it landed like the soft blow it was intended to be. He talked about the cost of lawyers and the length of court processes and the toll it took on people's health and peace of mind. He suggested that a mediated resolution, outside of the courts, through a family attorney they had spoken with, would be faster, less damaging, and more aligned with what Harold would have wanted. What Harold would have wanted. They kept coming back to that. "And what resolution are you proposing?" I asked. Renee leaned forward. The story had shifted since the letter. Now it was not an acknowledgement, but a redirection. She said that Amber had borrowed the items temporarily, intending to return them, that there had been a communication failure, that the situation had escalated out of proportion, that if I withdrew the police report, they were prepared to return the ring. It had apparently been retrieved from the pawn shop, and the other items still in their possession, and we could all move forward. "And the items that were sold?" I asked. A pause. "We'd work something out." "A number," I said. "Give me a number." Gary shifted in his chair. Renee looked at Amber. Amber looked at the table. "We'd have to discuss what seems fair," Gary said. "The items are valued," I said. "I had them appraised last week. The total replacement value is $2,340. That number is documented." Silence around my kitchen table. "Mom," Renee said, and now the softness had an edge underneath it, the edge that had always been there. "Do you have any idea what a criminal charge would do to Amber? To her future? She's 26. She made a mistake. She made a series of deliberate decisions over at least 3 months," I said. "That's not a mistake. That's a pattern." Amber's head came up. Her expression had shifted. The flower holding remorse was gone, and what was underneath it was younger and harder and angrier. "You have more money than you need," she said. "That house is worth $400,000. You live there alone. You—" "Amber," Gary's voice was a warning. "No, let her speak," I said, and I looked at my granddaughter across the table with as much steadiness as I could carry. "I want to hear what you were going to say." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked away. "I have an attorney," I said. "Everything we discuss this evening can be used as documentation of the conversation. I'm going to ask you to leave now. If you want to make a formal offer of restitution, it goes through James Whitfield's office. His number is on the card I'm going to give you." I stood up and got the card from the counter where I had placed it 2 days ago, knowing this visit was coming. I set it in the middle of the table. Gary looked at the card. Renee looked at me. Something in her expression cracked for a moment. Not remorse, but something older. Something that might have been, in another version of this story, grief. "This isn't what families do," she said. "No," I agreed, "it isn't. They left. The tulips stayed on the counter in their cellophane because no one had thought to put them in water, and I wasn't going to do it for them." After the door closed, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked. I was afraid. The kind of afraid that is not panic, but a low, serious hum, because I had now seen clearly that they were not going to stop on their own. They were going to continue until consequence became undeniable. That fear was uncomfortable and entirely rational, and I let it settle in me, and then I let it become what fear, properly held, can become. The clearest possible reason to keep going. I went back to the stove and turned the burner on under my soup. The meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks after I had filed the police report. James Whitfield had negotiated a conference, not a trial, but a formal sit-down with the detective assigned to my case, a representative from the county prosecutor's office, myself, James, Renee, Amber, and their attorney, a man named Douglas Farr, who had an expensive suit and the particular manner of a lawyer who has built a career on helping people avoid consequences they deserved. The room was in a county building on West 3rd, windowless, with a long table and chairs that were slightly too hard. I arrived 15 minutes early, which James had advised. I wore my gray wool jacket and Harold's watch, which I had taken to wearing on my left wrist since my wedding ring came back. I sat at the table and folded my hands and waited. They came in together. Renee, Amber, and Douglas Farr. Renee looked at me once and then looked at the table. Amber did not look at me at all. Douglas Farr sat down and opened a leather portfolio and arranged things on the table with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been in many rooms like this and planned to leave each one with his client still standing. The detective, a compact, serious woman named Detective Navarro, laid out the evidentiary record in 15 minutes. It was precise and methodical and contained no editorializing. The security camera footage, the pawn shop transaction record, the identification on file, the online listing, the appraiser's report I had commissioned, the voicemail Amber had left me, which I had retained and provided, the record of the Tuesday evening visit, which I had documented in writing and provided to James, including the approximate content of the conversation. As Detective Navarro went through the documentation, I watched Douglas Farr's expression. It went through several changes, each one carefully controlled, but the sequence was readable. He had not seen all of this. Amber and Renee had not told him everything. Whatever story they had brought to his office had not included the full ledger. He asked to speak with his clients privately. We recessed for 15 minutes. When they came back, the leather portfolio was closed, and Douglas Farr set his hands on the table and said that his clients wished to make a full acknowledgement of the events in question and to present a formal offer of restitution. What happened next was the part that, later, I would think about most often. Amber's composure broke. She did not cry in the way that softens a room. She cried in the way of someone who has, finally, run out of moves. Sharp, ugly, real. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far. She said Renee had told her it would be fine. She said Renee had been the one who suggested it first, who had scoped out the items over months, who had told her grandma had too much and didn't notice things anymore. Renee's head snapped around. "That is not—" "You told me she'd never know," Amber said, and her voice was raw and young in a way that, in another circumstance, might have moved me. "You said she was getting forgetful, and she wouldn't miss a few things." "I said no such thing." "You absolutely said that, at Gary's kitchen table in December." Douglas Farr put a hand on the table between them. "My clients—" "He has no clients," Detective Navarro said quietly, "who are not both implicated in the same transaction." The room was very quiet. I looked at Renee, my daughter. She had her chin up and her jaw set, and I could see her working through the angles. The angles she had always worked through when the facts of a situation stopped serving her. And for the first time, I watched her find that there were no angles left. The documentation was complete. The witness was her own granddaughter. The story had nowhere to go. "Renee," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were bright and dry. "I want you to understand," I said, "that I'm not doing this because I want to hurt you. I'm doing this because you took something that was not yours, and because what was not yours was not merely valuable. It was the last thing your father touched with his hands before he died. And you knew that. You knew exactly what it was." She said nothing. "Now," I said, and I turned to James. Let's proceed. The offer of restitution was accepted as part of a formal agreement supervised by the prosecutor's office. Full return of the recovered items, documented accounting of the 3 items that had been sold, and a restitution payment schedule for the replacement value. In exchange, provided all terms were met, the matter would be handled as a civil settlement rather than a criminal prosecution. Elder financial abuse charges would remain on record as a filed complaint. Douglas Farr signed. Renee signed. Amber signed, with her hand visibly unsteady. I signed last. I was very steady. The ring came back to me the following Monday. James Whitfield handed it to me in his office. It had been held by the detective's office after being retrieved from the pawn shop as part of the investigation. He placed it in a small evidence bag on his desk and then stepped back and let me handle it. I opened the bag and set the ring on the center of my palm. Yellow gold. Warm from the room. The solitaire and the thin band of anniversary diamonds. 48 years of every meaning that word can hold. I slipped it on. It still fit. Of course it still fit. There's something else, I said. Something I haven't told anyone. James looked at me. I explained about the ring. Not its history, its construction. Harold had a specific reason for choosing this particular setting 3 years before he died. He had known he was getting older. He had known I was stubborn and practical and not given to sentiment in the formal sense. He had found a jeweler who, on his request, had made a small modification to the bezel setting, the area beneath the stone, so that it unlatched. A tiny hidden compartment, just large enough to hold a folded scrap of paper. He had put a note inside, 2 lines in his handwriting. I had discovered it by accident 2 days after his funeral, when I was turning the ring in my fingers in the dark and felt the latch give. I had never shown it to anyone. I pressed the small latch now in James's office, and it opened, and the folded square of paper was still inside, slightly worn at the creases. You are not alone, Dot. You never were. H. James Whitfield, a man of considerable professional composure, looked at the opposite wall for a moment. Amber didn't know, I said. She couldn't have because the latch was not visible unless you knew where to press. She sold the ring without knowing that she was also selling a note from a dead man to his wife. I folded the paper back and closed the compartment. I've thought about that a great deal. Does it change anything? James asked carefully. No, I said. It confirms everything. The weeks that followed were the business of resolution. The 3 sold items, the silver frame, the fountain pen, Harold's mother's candlestick holders, had all been sold through Amber's resale account. 2 of the buyers were located and the items purchased back at the agreed appraised value, which Renee and Amber paid from the restitution schedule. The 3rd item, the candlesticks, had been resold again and could not be traced. The full appraised value was paid in cash, documented, and receipted. Renee and I did not speak during this period. She had an attorney handle all communication, as did I. That was appropriate. The formality was not coldness. It was the shape that honesty takes when trust has been removed and not yet, if ever, rebuilt. I also did 2 other things during this period. First, I updated my will. I worked with Margaret Osey over 3 appointments and made provisions that were clear, documented, and witnessed. The house, should I choose to sell or leave it, would go to a trust I established for 2 causes Harold had cared about: the public library system and a local hospice that had cared for him in his final days. Personal items were individually assigned with a notarized list. Nothing was left ambiguous. Nothing was left to interpretation. Second, I had a locksmith change every lock in the house, not because I expected another theft, but because there are things you do for yourself, not for strategy, not for evidence, not for attorneys, that simply mean, this is mine, and I know that now in a way I did not know before. The evening I got the locks changed, I sat on the front porch in the last of the April light with a glass of iced tea in my rocking chair. And I thought about what Harold had said to me the night he'd given me the ring back, the original ring, on our 30th anniversary, in this kitchen. You deserve more than I've given you, Dot. You gave me everything I needed, Harold. You just gave some of it to me after you were gone. Block 9. To new life. The heroine thrives. The antagonists face their own consequences. Spring turned into summer, and I found myself, to my own mild surprise, better than I had been in years. Not happy in a shallow way, not relentlessly cheerful, not reborn, not transformed by adversity into some other person. Myself, but clarified. The way a room looks when you've moved the furniture that was always slightly wrong and the proportions finally make sense. I went back to the library on my regular schedule. I started a new garden bed along the back fence. Dahlias and black-eyed Susans and a row of lavender that Harold would have liked. I began attending a book group at the community center, which I had been meaning to join for 2 years. I made friends there, 2 women my age named Carol and Paulette, who were sharp and funny and asked good questions and did not treat me as someone to be managed. We started meeting for breakfast on Saturdays, and I found, with some astonishment, that I laughed at those breakfasts with a frequency and ease I had not known in a long time. June and I continued our Wednesday card games. Phil, her son-in-law, stopped by in May to update the security system, and I let him, and this time I paid attention to how it all worked. I was not going to need someone else to navigate it for me again. I also, that summer, called the jeweler who had made Harold's modification to the ring. His name was Mr. Ferretti, and he was 80 years old and still worked 4 days a week from the same shop on Brown Street he had run for 50 years. I wanted to thank him for his work and to tell him that the compartment had served its purpose in ways Harold had probably not envisioned. Mr. Ferretti was quiet for a moment and then said, "That man loved you very specifically, not generally. Specifically." I sat with those words for several days. As for Renee and Amber and Gary, I learned what I learned without seeking it out, because a town like Dayton does not keep secrets very efficiently. Renee and Gary's marriage had been under strain well before this began, it turned out. The stress of the investigation, the attorney's fees, the restitution payments, the exposure of what had happened to several people in their social circle who had been told a different version of events, accelerated what was already fracturing. By July, Gary had moved out. By September, Renee had put the Centerville house on the market. She downsized to an apartment in a complex near the highway, smaller, quieter, less expensive. She was, from what I understood, in therapy. I hoped it was helping. I meant that sincerely, without irony. Amber's situation was harder. The formal complaint of elder financial abuse on record, even without criminal prosecution, was discoverable. When she applied for a position at a financial services firm in Columbus that summer, the background check flagged the complaint, and the offer was rescinded. She found different work eventually, in retail management, which was not what she had planned. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I felt something more complicated. The particular sadness of watching someone live inside the architecture of their own bad choices, which is not the same as punishment and not the same as justice, but is its own kind of result. She sent me a letter in October. It was 4 paragraphs. It did not ask anything of me. It said only that she knew what she had done, that she was sorry in the specific way, not the general way, and that she hoped eventually I would believe that. She did not ask for a response. She did not offer conditions. I read it sitting at Harold's desk. I thought about it for several days. Then I put it in a separate folder from the legal documents, a new folder without a label, and I let it sit there. I did not know yet what I would do with it. Some things take longer than a single season to resolve. What I did know was this: I was not waiting. I was not diminished. I was not rattling around in a too large house. I was a woman of 71 years living in the home she had built with the person she had loved, tending her garden, arguing about books with Carol and Paulette on Saturday mornings, sitting on the front porch in the evenings with Harold's watch on her wrist and a glass of something cold, watching the street grow quiet. The rocking chairs were still both on the porch. That had not changed. What had changed was that I sat in mine differently now, straighter perhaps, and with the specific weight of someone who has been tested and did not fold. That is not nothing. At 71 or at any other age, that is not nothing at all. Harold used to say that dignity is not something anyone can give you. You either hold on to it or you don't, and the holding is the whole of the work. I held on. Not because I was fearless. I was frightened many times. Not because I was certain. There were mornings when doubt was the loudest voice in the room, but because the alternative to holding on was to become someone I did not recognize, in a house I did not deserve to lose, mourning a man who had believed in me specifically. If you are watching or listening to this and you have felt the particular loneliness of being dismissed by the people who should protect you most, I want you to know that clarity is available to you. Document. Take it slowly. Find one person you trust. Use the tools that exist, even when using them is hard. And if someone tells you that your grief makes you less entitled to what is yours, that your age or your loss or your solitude means the rules apply to you differently, let me be the one to tell you. They are wrong, and they are counting on you to believe them. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment. It matters more than you might think. And thank you, truly, for being here. Dorothy Mae Calloway, Dayton, Ohio.